Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Jose Hasemann, and I am currently a research fellow at Iscte-CRIA. Thank you all for coming today, despite this weather. I've been hearing it's kind of unusual to have this much rain this time of year, and thank you all for coming out. We welcome you today to the second event that we organized for Professor Dana Francisco Miranda's visit to Iscte. Today, Professor Miranda will be presenting on his book, The Coloniality of Happiness. Before providing some background information on our speaker and on his book, I would like to also thank Iscte and CRIA in general for their institutional support. And specifically, I would like to thank CRIA's director, Professor Afroish, as well as Professors Matos from the Governance, Policies, and Livelihoods Research Group, and Professors Saavedra and Quintela from the Anthropology of Health thematic line for including these events within their program. I would like to also thank Andreina Caires, Mafalda Melo Sosa, and Inés Lourenço for taking care of the logistics that made today possible, and also Carlos Moreira for the design of the promotional material. I would also like to thank the European Commission and the Fundação Luso-Americana, whose generous support made it possible to bring our speaker today to Iscte. And finally, I would like to thank João Mineiro, who has been an important part of the organization of both today's event and the one that we had on Monday. Now, a little bit about Professor Miranda. Dana's work is in political philosophy, Africana philosophy, and psychosocial studies. Dana recently graduated with a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Connecticut Stores, investigating the philosophical significance of suicide, depression, and well-being for members of the African diaspora. He proudly serves as Secretary for Digital Outreach and Chair of Architectonics for the Caribbean Philosophical Association, is Faculty Fellow for the Applied Ethics Center at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and is co-director for Pixie Boston, a summer institute committed to broadening inclusion in philosophy. Dana is also a senior editor for Caliban's Readings, a blog hosted by the Caribbean Philosophical Association and invested in shifting the geography of reason. Caliban's Readings serves as a vehicle for greater outreach and appreciation for the epistemologies, experiences, and philosophies emerging from the global south. Some of Dana's recent peer-reviewed publications include Hierarchies of Foreignness, The Writing of Man in the New World, from 2021 in the Journal of World Philosophies, Signals Crossed, Why Double Consciousness and the Role of the Critic, from 2021 in the Journal of Philosophy of Education, and The Violence of Leadership and Black Lives Matters from 2021 in the edited volume, The Movement for Black Lives. In his talk today, Dana will be sharing with us on his current book, The Coloniality of Happiness. In his book, Dana explores how one can and should understand Black well-being in a world structured by racism and coloniality. Using primarily the works of Afro-Martinican psychiatrist and philosopher Frantz Fanon and his account of sociodiagnostics, this project examines depression and suicide within the African diaspora. Employing existential phenomenology, Africana philosophy, and psychiatric models, Professor Miranda argues that Afro-diasporic subjects face systematic unwellness under disordered socio-political arrangements. Without further delay, please help me to welcome Professor Dana Francisco Miranda.
So thank you everyone for joining me today. It's been a wonderful time in Lisboa. Just as a note before I begin, this is going to be a very condensed book project. In terms of what I'm presenting, I'm only presenting work in really section 2 of my work. So section 1 really looked at psychological accounts of depression and asked where do they go wrong, what are missing in their accounts. And that's where Frantz Fanon, in particular, his work on sociodiagnostics, that in order to diagnose conditions, we have to look at the particular social conditions people face, really pushed me to rethink not only how we define depression, but also what we think are solutions or cures for depression. So rather than being an individualistic take, you go to a therapist in order to get well. Frantz Fanon has always pushed me to think, what if the actual society or environments we live in are structured by unwellness? What if they're structured by disorder? So even our concepts such as wellness, happiness, are actually problematic. It would actually be wrong. It'd actually be harmful for certain people to achieve happiness or wellness in that disordered political arrangement. So oftentimes I deal with racism, oftentimes I deal with coloniality, but I still wanted to say, although I'm looking at a particular social condition, I think there are numerous social ills in any given society, any given polity, and that you could also say depression can look different for queer people, for trans people. Depression can look different for women facing sexism. again, it's a very limited book project where I'm dealing with Africana people, but I think Fanon's point still holds. So that was really section 1 of my book. And then section 2, which I'll introduce to you all today in a number of slides, is saying if we push that thought further, how can we criticize happiness as an alternative to depression or an alternative to just existing within a society, but pushing it even further and saying, well, if Africana people have lived under disorder arrangements for 500 plus years due to slavery, due to colonization, maybe they have alternative arrangements that we can call upon today to say, if happiness isn't our desired goal, maybe it's not the effective value we actually think it is. What are some alternative notions? And I use the notion of the ecstatic, I use notions such as Africana well-being. What can we put in place of the value of happiness? So instead of being a purely negative project, just to admit someone, instead of being a purely negative project, I wanted to, again, give something positive. And again, if anyone's interested in section 3, where I also critique notions of our sense of freedom under these arrangements, the freedom to be well, what would that actually look like? What are we well enough to accomplish in the face of disorder? Please, in the Q&A, ask me any questions about any part of the project. But again, I just wanted to be fully honest that this is really about section 2 of the book project. With that said, I'm just gonna hide the floating panel so you can see everything. So within this talk, I'm gonna briefly introduce myself, introduce a particular question for the project. Then I'm gonna talk about affective state. So what is the basic definition of happiness, for instance? Then I'm gonna give examples about happy slaves, gonna give you my definition of the coloniality of happiness. And then the last 3 sections, Marinage, Carnaval, are gonna give you examples of what I call our ecstatic communities. So if happiness is not the value we think it is, I want to put in place of that ecstatic community. And then of course the Q&A is where I get to interact more fully with you all and engage with your questions. But again, it's very condensed, about 7 slides. They're going to be filled with quotations, but I'm going to, again, point to what I think is the most relevant of it. And this is going to be recording. And I'm also going to feel free to share this PowerPoint with you all. So I will make sure Jose has it, so you guys can actually look at the quotations in depth. So with that said, let us begin. So my introduction is actually pulling upon a Du Bois quote that's actually going to frame the very end of my talk. But in that quotation, he talks about the possibility of uncreated worlds. And as someone who suffers from depression, who has not only have the lived experience of depression ever since I was 16, but also as someone researching depression, I have always been interested in like the possibilities, especially when I was younger, about what would my life have looked like without depression? What does my life look like with depression? What uncreated worlds were created with just this mood disorder? This psychological condition created different possibilities and created new worlds for me. And even though depression, the framing psychological disorder, a mood disorder, is often framed as negative, I at least want to be honest to people's lived experience and saying, whether it's about affective values, whether it's about depression itself, it's not a purely negative phenomenon. I still have joy, even though I have bouts of depression. I can still laugh. I can still have joy. I can still have anger. Again, depression doesn't eliminate because it's not a totality. There are cycles within depression. Sorry, and admit other people. So with that said, I would like to again thank Jose Hasemann and Iscte-Instituto for the invitation to talk more about my book project. In particular, what I'd actually like to discuss today. Okay, so I can leave it on. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the 2 questions that are really animating the conversation I'd like to have with you all is in that second bullet point. Why should we not be happy? So instead of asking like, Why should we be happy? Why should we go after our joys? I wanted to flip that and say maybe happiness isn't the value we actually think it is. In particular, for people suffering depression, why shouldn't we aim for happiness? Why is that a value we shouldn't seek to obtain? And hopefully, as I go throughout the slides, I can give you examples as to why certain versions of happiness that are very prevalent today in our society are actually harmful. They're actually suboptimal. Actually attaining happiness would actually do us a disservice. Now, this is again drawing on Frantz Fanon's notion of sociodiagnostics, in particular his notion of, if we turn to Black skin, white mass, where each chapter notes a particular failure of it. So chapter 1, where he talks about language in Martinique. Of course, we're Martinican, we're Afro descendants. But if I master French, if I master the French language, therefore I will be treated as a French person. And Frantz Fanon says, no matter how much you perfect the Parisian dialect, no matter how perfectly you speak French, at the end of the day, I'm going to be treated as a Black colonial individual. And so even though Frantz Fanon had a desire as a young man to master French and therefore to become French, he failed at his task. But again, that failure is something positive, because if he was actually able to become French, there would be certain things lost. In particular, the thing that would be lost is to be replication and, how would I put this? In a sense, a stamp of approval on French colonization. It would be to say that being French, there's nothing problematic given its colonization, given its racism. So I always take Black skin, white mass as an example of each chapter Fanon failing as an individual, and as the theorist pointing back and saying, I'm glad I failed at becoming not Black. That instead we have to find out ways in which Blackness can actually become alive. And so with that in mind, what I want us to recenter is, if actually obtaining happiness is detrimental for Africana people, then we should be able to fail happily at that task. Because there are other effective values out there that are actually going to be more beneficial. And I'm going to have historical and contemporary examples that I hope show that this is actually what we should be aiming for. And lastly, I just want to again frame that my notions of colonial happiness is always going to take place in the background of Africana resistance. That the happiness instituted trying to set in place has always been resisted by Africana people once we come to notice it. And so in the face of colonial disstates, again, states of being that are actually harmful for Black people, I'm putting forward a notion that there are such things as ecstatic communities and well order that come about. So what do I mean by effective states? So these are going to be very basic definitions, but before going in depth into my talk, I wanted to at least frame how I see happiness, how I see sadness, and how I see depression. So these definitions are in part a play on Jean-Paul Sartre's work on the emotions and outline. They're a play on Sarah Ahmed's work, The Promise of Happiness. But what both individuals know is that happiness, sadness, depression, they can really be reduced to what we call as moods. And all moods have weather-like qualities. So what do I mean by this? So if we take our definition of happiness, so this is typically a normal emotional response characterized by an overabundance of positivity. Well, what does that mean in terms of like the weather quality? So when one is happy, one frequently sees possibilities as aligning with reality now. So, I really wanted this job. There's a possibility about that job. And the happier I am is the closer that possibility becomes my reality. Now, if that reality doesn't happen, that happiness can disappear. So again, when I think of this as effective surplus, there's a value of positivity. The world is colored a certain way where possibilities abound. The more happy I am, the more possibilities there are out in the world. However, with sadness, which is again a normal everyday response, the way we encounter the world, we can be saddened by it. I like calling this affective shortage because all those possibilities start dwindling up or drying up. And so for that particular emotion, sadness, I always talk about it similar to like a rain cloud or a rainstorm. And again, being in Lisboa right now, there's plenty of rain to go around. But my possibility of going out on a tour and seeing African sites, the possibility of going to the sporting stadium for my dad, all those possibilities dried up. And with that, again, sadness can come about because possibilities are no longer there. And so when we think of happiness and sadness, the framing of it, whereas one's a positive, one's frequently a negative, there's numbness involved in sadness, there's even disaffection at times. Importantly, what you'll often hear in conversations about depression, and this is comments I've received numerous times, especially when I was a teenager. Oh, you're just sad, Dana. Why don't you just smile? Why don't you just be happy? So if sadness, the opposite of sadness is happiness, frequently people think of depression as the same. That it's just an affective shortage. You just need to smile. You just need to put yourself out there. Those activities that used to bring you joy, just do them again. So the things that didn't seem like possibilities, just make them your reality. And now all of a sudden, sadness will turn into happiness. Or again, the frown will turn upside down. But if we're looking at theoreticians and their understanding, particularly in phenomenology and existentialism, about what makes depression uniquely different from sadness, is that whereas sadness is seen to be a normal emotional response that all humans have, depression is seen to be an abnormal state. It's seen to be a mood disorder in particular, and here I'm drawing off of Heidegger and Matthew Ratcliffe, who uses Heidegger to talk about depression. They say rather than depression being an affective shortage, like you just don't have enough possibilities, you just don't have enough positivity in your life. Those theorists always think of depression as really being, in a sense, an affective zero or nil. So rather than the ability to feel something positive or the ability to feel something negative, depression is a state where you can't feel at all. Again, that affective zero, the inability to feel moods. So when I'm in a state of depression, like again, I will always have depression. I'm not in a particular depressed mood at the moment. However, when I am depressed, my ability to feel zeros. So the joy I felt at an activity, of reading a book, no pleasure at all. Even with my partners, who I love greatly. So it can be parents, it can be siblings, it can be nieces, nephews. When I'm in a depressed mood, my feelings for them zero up. And so it took me a long time to figure out, well, how do I still interact with people I love when I feel nothing for them? And so just always being conscious, now that I'm older, hey, even though I'm not feeling anything at the moment, I know this matters for you. So I still need to treat you as I was if I was not depressed. If things were bringing me joy, if things were even bringing me sadness. And again, sadness and happiness aren't the only emotions. I'm condensing what it means to be human in only 3 emotions. But really, this is where, again, that first section of my book, Depression, really focuses on. If depression is that affective zero, how does society contribute or, again, help alleviate those feelings of affective zero? Because if you live in an anti-Black society as a Black individual, and that society is also telling you you're zero, you're nothing, how can that replicate those feelings of depression? So whereas personal relationships can be a cause of depression, racism can also be a cause of depression. Living under colonial conditions can also be a causes of depression. But again, if we're not looking at entire structures, but we're just looking at these emotions, I really just wanted to point out the side that depression, if it's an effective zero, is never going to be, again, the opposite of happiness. That whereas happiness and sadness are, again, normal responses, one's a surplus, one's an overabundance. Sorry, a surplus and a shortage. If depression is that effective zero, why did I make that claim on the other side that sometimes it's better to be depressed than happy? Why is it better for Africana people under certain conditions to have an effective zero, to feel nothing? And again, that means feeling worthless, feeling that there's no possibility in future. Again, think of your worst thoughts on depression. Like if you've seen televisions, if you read things, I'm making that claim that at times that depression is actually a healthier state to be in than what we actually think of as happiness. And I'm going to give examples, but again, that's the sums. That's the end game involved. Why can I make this claim? And again, as someone suffering from depression, is that, and I've gotten this sometimes, like, are you asking people not to see a psychologist, not to have medication? Are you saying depression's a good? I'm not, I'm just saying happiness is just that bad at times. So how do we get there? So I have two images on this slide. Both are depictions of discontented slaves. So slaves that are unhappy with their conditions. So the first image, the black and white image, is of a fugitive slave. So an escaped slave, a slave who ran away from the plantation. Again, they have a little knapsack on their back, but they're fleeing. This is often called petit marronage, again, but in Cabo Verde, we talk about Badiou communities, communities that escaped into the mountains to create their own communities. Again, but an unhappy slave, because if you were happy with being a slave, you would stay on the plantation. In the second image in color, the blow for blow, which is very famous image, deals with a slave uprising. And again, the violence to upend slavery, to create different possibilities, different uncreated worlds. But importantly, again, just going with the notions of happiness, if you're willing to risk life and limb, disability, destruction of your family, again, maiming, if you're willing to risk all of this to not be a slave, to not be enslaved, you're obviously not happy with that condition. But importantly, if you actually look at Benjamin Rush and Samuel Cartwright, who are, again, European descendant white individuals in the Americas, how did they talk about enslaved people? Because at all times, they were framing slavery as a happy condition for Black people. That without the institution of slavery, Black people would be misguided, would be unhappy, would be unwell. Again, Black people cannot govern themselves. This is why you need the patriarch, the beneficial or philanthropic slave master to guide them, to teach them Christianity, to teach them colonial languages. Again, the slave master is here to bring happiness to enslaved people. So famously enough, in the first quotation from Samuel Cartwright, this, what we'd call today is a pseudo-psychological term. Again, pseudo meaning fake. But during the time period, it wasn't treated as a fake disease, it's treated as an actual disease. This is mostly in the Caribbean, but it did have some instances in the United States as well. So drapetomania is the disease of running away. So that first individual in black and white, the fugitive slave, who said it's better to go out in the wilderness, it's better to go out in the mountains than stay on a slave plantation. He would be diagnosed with drapetomania. But importantly enough, for Cartwright, he said the desire to be free, the desire to run away itself was a symptom of mental alienation, a symptom of mental anguish. that a slave who desires to run away is an unhealthy slave. But fortunately, and Samuel Cartwright is also a doctor at the time, he goes, as a doctor, as a physician, you slave masters can come to me and I can help cure this disease. I can help cure the disease of freedom in Black people. And so this psychological practice of curing slaves, what does that actually mean in practice? Well, there's a term, and again, I'm not going to say it fully, but the term used during the day is if we're taking the N-word, and it's a N-word breaker. So a Black breaker, a person that breaks the souls, breaks the thoughts, breaks the back of enslaved people. So oftentimes the cure for drapetomania was, again, more harsh punishment, making you, again, break any desire you have for freedom. So the only possibility you have in your life is to be a slave, for your children to be a slave, for your grandchildren to be a slave. Sorry, I just want to make sure everyone can keep seeing things. Let me do closed captions, and then I'll leave it all. So again, if we're looking at historical instances of what happiness means, drapetomania was showing the ways in which slave masters and slavers wanted slaves to be content with their conditions, wanted them to be happy being enslaved. And I think a parallel still exists today, that often the way we frame happiness is for people to become well-adjusted, or in my sense, maladjusted to social conditions that are inherently anti-Black, inherently racist, inherently uphold colonialism or coloniality in more modern times. Now, Benjamin Rush is a little bit more unique because he said, yeah, enslaved Black people are the merriest people in the world. They're the happiest people in the world. Look at them sing and dance. Now, oftentimes these songs and dance were actually part of the Fugitive Project. I'm going to sing about the North Star, so if you want to run away up north, you know what star can guide you there. But again, it's less about the historical truth of the matter, but seeing the flip side. Because when we think of slavery today, we mostly think of it in terms of condemnation. This was a moral wrong, is a poor political project, economic project, but slavery was a peculiar institution that deserved to die away. Most people have those moral misgivings about slavery. Not everyone, unfortunately. Slavery still exists today in many parts of the world. But again, if we're putting ourselves in the shoes, again, the very unfortunate shoes of slave masters, at all times, they thought they could be Christian and treat slave people that way and still go to heaven. They didn't see anything wrong with their practices because they weren't dealing with human beings. They were dealing with chat. They were dealing with property. And at the same time, the same core belief they had is that Black people are the happiest enslaved. Oh, there's a slave uprising, they're a fugitive. That just means that they're mentally unwell. Again, that's the rationalization because they couldn't deal with reality. And so if happy slaves are, again, direct historical instances, whether you're talking about in Africa, the Americas, Caribbeans, what should we think about happiness today? Well, for me, what I wanted to bring up is what I call the coloniality of happiness. At other times in the book, I call it just colonial happiness, just to shorten things. But for me, when I talk about the coloniality of happiness, I'm talking about the ways in which happiness as an effective value is misused. So what is the primary way I see it as being misused? I think it's being misused when the desire for happiness is simultaneously a call to become adjusted to oppression, dehumanization, racism, coloniality, etc. And again, I think the colonial happiness, there are other versions of happiness that are equally deformed or pathological for other groups. But for this talk, again, I'm focusing on Africana people. And so the type of happiness that is being offered to Black people in the modern day, I think in terms of a norm and in terms of an ideal, it just doesn't match up. So by a norm, happiness is something that we should all have, that is out in the world, that can be easily obtained. It's a normal, again, it's just a normal emotional response. Again, Black people, I'm not saying Black people aren't happy, but the value of that happiness, is it normal or abnormal? The ideal of happiness that we should not only ascribe to it, but we should pursue that happiness. Well, what is the version of happiness being offered? Is it just that possibility, that overabundance of positivity? No, oftentimes it's not simply positivity, it's ascribing our emotions to our particular socio-political order. In other words, what I'm arguing using Frantz Fanon in this book is that you can never have an emotion that is divorced itself from the environment. That's one of the earliest lessons I learned from Fanon, and it's the one I carry with me in this book project. That whether we're talking about language, whether we're talking about food and culture, whether we're talking about our emotions ourselves, you cannot divorce it from the environment you grow up in. So if I think of happiness as something that, again, brings an overabundance of positivity, that possibility is now becoming a reality. Well, all I simply have to ask myself is, well, what are the things that make me happy? Because, again, those things that make me happy actually exist in the world. Again, unless you're living a complete, like, again, ascetic life where the happiness is just, again, pure thought, has nothing to do with reality itself, I don't think most people function that way. And so let me just use one example, is that in the United States, for instance, there's only really one corporation, Chocolate Corporation, that really takes child slavery in Africa seriously. Every other type of chocolate is mired in slavery scandals. Nestle, for instance, even answered Congress and said, well, it seems that you're using child slavery in Africa to, again, get the cacao beans. There's numerous instances. Can you guys stop that? Can you do, what are your preventative measures? And Nestle answered in print and writing. Again, they didn't hide this. They just said, no, because if we try to do anything, the cost would just go to consumers and they would be unhappy. Again, we can't do anything about slavery because the price would rise for consumers. So when I give this example to students, if chocolate brings you happiness, if that's the material object that makes me happy, again, I'm someone who loves Reese's peanut butter cups. Everyone can go around the room and say, what's your desire? Some people like Snickers, some like Kit Kat, some like Godiva. Again, like you can go really fancy. But at the end of the day, if almost every single corporation, particularly in the United States, has that happy chocolate, but it's based on the suffering of children in Africa, why should I try to, why is happiness a good thing to be in that particular moment? And that's only one object. You can talk about clothing, you can talk about computer chips, you can talk about cobalt mining, you can talk about, if you're talking about batteries and electric batteries, you can talk about like Tesla in South America. But frequently the things that make us the happiest are mired in, again, oppression or exploitation. Similarly, the two quotations I have below, one by Amilcar Cabral and one by Martin Luther King Jr., point to the ways in which even in this modern day, even after the colonial moment, even after apparently, again, with the election of Obama, the United States became post-racial, only then to have Trump, and only to have, again, affirmative action being canceled under a Democratic president. Even our notions of happiness today are entwined with social environments that are inherently disordered for Black flourishing. So Cabral points out in this quotation, and he's talking about luso-tropicalism. Again, the theory that the Portuguese had the best type of colonization because there was miscegenation. Again, rather than having like a one-drop rule of Hippo descent where Black people are uniquely different from white people and the two should never mix. Oh, they're Criollo people. Aha, if Criollo people exist and they're accepted under a colonial system, as Cabral pointed out, hey, colonized people from Cabo Verde, from Guinea-Bissau, from São Tomé, from Angola, you guys live under the best possible world for you people. You live under the best colonial condition. And again, Cabral said, what type of yearning, what type of happiness is this? But at all times, there are propaganda machines that are trying to convince, like, this is the happiness, like, you need to be happy, but why should I be happy with the social conditions I live under? And what Cabral was pointing out, again, there's deep unhappiness within these Africana communities. And again, they're going to show that through a revolution. They're going to show that through liberation movement and decolonization. Now, if we go to a different context in the United States, King approaches this in a different way. And he says that frequently, whether we're going to a therapist, whether you're in school, whether you're at the job, frequently those figures of authority say they're trying to help you get well, help you achieve happiness. But what they're actually trying to do is adjust you to that certain social condition. So, doctor, I'm very depressed. I can't even go to work. What are the things making you depressed? Like, there's everyday racism in the United States. They're building more cop cities for more policing. There's the issue in Palestine with Gaza and ongoing genocide. There are numerous things that contribute to my depression. It's never simply one thing. Okay, well, what can we control? How can we get you back to work? Remember, like, you can be happy. I'm like, why should I be happy at all if this is the world I exist in? And this is not to say all therapists, all psychologists don't take the social conditions in mind. But what Fanon was really good at when he was looking at Algerians said the reason why a lot of Algerians are unwell and have psychological issues is because they live under colonial conditions. He didn't go about a process of saying, okay, come to a therapy session and I'm going to help you get through your day-to-day. Because what Fanon said is that if I adjusted those Algerians to colonization, I'm actually adjusting them to a disorder. I'm adjusting them to unhealthy conditions. And so for King here, when he's talking about racism, when he's talking about his war against poverty, war against militarism, he's saying that there are things in the United States that I should never adjust myself to. That instead, maladjustment is actually a better mark of health than adjustment to, again, the American condition. And this is what I, again, am talking about when our notions of happiness are about being adjusted. Our notions where our thoughts about what makes us positive are never connected to our social environment. When those types of happiness abound, when they're very popular, then everyday individuals, but even depressed individuals, happiness is not something that we should seek to obtain, but rather we should seek ways of being maladjusted. And fortunately enough, there are Black instances of maladjustment, refusal to adjust themselves to colonialism, to racism, that give us different notions of well-being. So if colonial happiness isn't our thing, if it's actually more detrimental? What are some Africana notions of well-being that we can use as alternatives? Well, the first example that I already briefly talked about is with marriage. So petite marriage or fugitivity is when one individual escapes to outside of the slave plantation. They can go, in the United States, they would flee south to Mexico, some would flee north to Canada, Nova Scotia, some would flee north to, again, the Boston area, New Bedford, where I'm from. There's a huge former enslaved community there. But what's interesting enough is that there are actually two versions of fugitivity in scholarship. Petite marriage is when the individual escapes. Grand marriage is when individuals escape and form their own community. So again, we're not talking about Badius and the CRIA or Santiago, to be more geographically honest. For Cabo Verdeans, Badiou communities are those who escaped Portuguese enslavement and colonization within the mountains. And you'll see this throughout the Atlantic, in Jamaica, in Peru, Ecuador, again, the United States. The particular picture I have, along with the quotation, is from the Great Dismal Swamp in the United States. And so when these individuals would escape together, and then more people would find them in the swamp or in the mountains, again, places that were very inaccessible to colonizers and enslavers, it's difficult to get there. But while it's difficult to get there, there were still types of life making involved. And so for me, what maroon communities point to is that sometimes one cannot be at home and live under disordered arrangement. Whether that's slavery, whether that's colonization, maybe even today in the lives, the modern day lives of the, maybe we shouldn't be at home in our institutions. Again, as an academic, I mean the literal institutions. Maybe they're actually not sites of our wellness. Maybe our happiness doesn't go step in step with our institution. And so what the lesson of Marinade shows is that you can create life elsewhere. And again, a lot of maroon communities were unfortunately constantly at war or constantly on the defensive. Because at any moment, those colonizer enslavers could recapture them. There are also instances such as in Jamaica where they resisted for so long, 20 years, that they actually made agreements with the English government. So they got some form of legal protection, but that legal protection was on the backs of other enslaved people. So in order for their community to be protected, they had to agree to return other enslaved people back to those plantations. And again, the history of Marinade spans numerous polities, numerous locations. They each have their own unique history. But importantly, if those spaces are constantly at war, those spaces are constantly threatened, and again, they're very inaccessible places in order to protect themselves. One thing I at least want to think with Marinade is that these are still spaces. That rather than thinking of happiness as just a value we have or an emotion, then maybe the happiness or the value, the well-being that we can obtain has to actually be materialized in the spaces around us. That it's never an individual project, but it's a grand project that we have to, again, take on together, while still learning the lessons of historical Marinage that maybe we need to be better with our compromises. How do we seek to extend the spaces in which people can be well? But again, you can't be at home in the disorder. You have to step away from it. And again, I just really wanted this quote from Harriet Beecher Stowe because again, it gives you a sense of just what Marinage actually entails. So, the rejoice in a savage exuberance, a bid defiance to all human efforts to either penetrate or subdue. These wild regions of the world, filled with alligator, the moccasin, the American slave, again, in the wilderness, in the non-civilized parts of the world that were inaccessible, that again, were covered by protective areas, whether it's the landscape, whether it's the animals themselves, the flora and fauna. All of these are necessary, that these spaces actually need protective features, or they need, in a sense, I want to say interdependence, but I'm trying to think of a more translatable word. They need to be constructed hand in hand with others. Now, fortunately, when we're talking about notions of well-being, again, because escaped enslaved Africans who went there did have some form of well-being. They weren't brutalized by a slave master. They had a sense of freedom of mobility. Again, it was a hard life, life constantly on guard, but it was still a life that many people said was preferable to slavery. Now, interestingly enough, if marriage knowledge is about the spaces of well-being that can be created, I also think Carnival shows the temporality, the time of happiness or well-being that can be constructed. So I have a quotation by Cesaria, and interestingly enough, I just want to read the end, that it is the Carnival, a jubilation to be found nowhere else. But I did want to bold the Morabeza sem igual. Morabeza doesn't just mean jubilation without equal. And so the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about Morabeza, which is about bringing together notions of wellness and hospitality, and jubilation. Jubilation's part of it, but it's also about the sense of welcomingness. That when you come to Carnival, it doesn't matter if you're a tourist, it doesn't matter if you're from the diaspora, it doesn't matter if, again, you just live on the island. That what you're going to actually face here is hospitality. So again, Morabeza, for me growing up as Cape Verdean, it had that sense of jubilation with it, but it always was tied to your hospitality. That my joy is tied to, again, welcoming you and my joy. And now it's our joy that's being constructed during Carnival. But outside of this notion of Morabeza as, again, an alternative notion of happiness, that it's not individualistic, it's not just about positivity divorced from social conditions. My jubilation is tied to welcoming you in communities, and therefore it's becoming something we share together. Is that if you look at the film, and it's from 2015, it's a documentary, Chindas, is that during this film, it's set in São Vicente too, again, the most popular Carnival, even though Carnival happens in most of the other islands. Most people will go to Mindelo for Carnival in Cabo Verde. That if you look at this Carnival, and particularly two figures, the Queen of Carnival, Chinda Andrade, and then other figures such as Nina Pintanga and Elvis Tolentino. But again, the Queen of Carnival. So Chindas is a word in Cabo Verde that points to the transgender community. Now, sometimes it also points to, again, cross-dressing individuals, or what older literature would call transvestite, again, shying away from that. But if the queer community is accepted, again, Chinda is being crowned as the Queen of Carnival during multiple years. But also, if you know anything about Cape Verdean society, again, Chinda is not a word we use in the United States for queer people or trans people. It's a very unique to Cabo Verde. But if you actually look at Cape Verdean culture, and again, pointing to the room, like, again, very Christian. Whether you're in the United States, whether you're in Cabo Verde, again, outside of Mindelo, being queer and being trans is not something usually celebrated. It's usually denigrated. It's usually, again, there's a lot of violence. Again, and this is worldwide, trans and queer people are seen to be abnormal, as something wrong in need of correction. But during Carnival and Mindelo, the social order, what is common in one society, during particular times gets thrown out the window. So carnival is a sense of disorder. What was previously unaccepted during normal times becomes something that can have center stage. And again, the documentary, I think, does a wonderful job, but this is multiple years. And again, it has multiple trans and queer people being celebrated and even crowned with the highest achievement. And so for me, Carnival just doesn't show instances of Marabaza, but it says, how can we have our notions of queerness and belonging radically upended? Because if we're talking about Africana notions of well-being, Africana people aren't homogenous. There are queer African people. And so for Carnival, what do it mean to have Marabaza where that hospitality isn't just a radical welcome during Carnival season, but every day? What if we extend the time of our jubilation, the time of our Marabaza? And so for me, whereas marriage is limited because the spaces are constantly at war, and we need to find ways to constantly expand those spaces, Carnival is temporally limited. That you only get to have a radical acceptance during the season. After that, there's poverty, there's, again, sexual violence, there's just, again, violence overall, but you are seen to be abnormal again. Now, Carnival is in Cabo Verde, Brazil. Again, you can go in many places on the Atlantic and say, no, this is something that many African communities have. Jocono in Jamaica. Again, they might have Mardi Gras in United States. They might have different names to it. But why is it only during certain time periods do we feel that the normal everyday operations need to be upended? And people that were previously, again, denigrated, celebrated. Why do we only have that for a season? And so I took those two things, Marinage and Carnival, and saying, there are so many historical examples of Africana people saying that the conditions we live under don't bring us joy. The type of happiness they want us to be, the happy slave, the contented slave, or the contented colonial subject. We disagree with that. We violently resist those notions and affects. If that is the case, why in the modern day do we still see happiness as something divorced from sociality? And if we can bring those two together, emotions and environments are always tied together. The things that make you happy oftentimes shouldn't. Oftentimes, if you're using Lauren Berlant and her notions of cruel optimism, the things that bring us our joy are often the things that set us back. Then the coloniality of happiness is saying that although I'm talking about depression, although I'm talking about suicide in the third section of my book, if we're just talking about our normal everyday lives, if you've never had a suicidal thought, if you've never been depressed, what I'm trying to point to is saying, what if we rethink the values when we tie them to society? Because often it's about changing the society, according to Frantz Fanon, that will actually bring about new values and new worlds. That our well-being might not actually be achievable under the disorder we live under. So become maladjusted. Saying, yes, you have depression, but I'm never trying to be happy. Maybe I have to construct a different way of being well in this world. And so, to end before the Q&A, for me, when you take Marinage, when you take Carnival, all of these are notions of what I call our ecstatic community. And ecstasy is, again, a term that talks about joy, the ecstasy of dancing. Again, there's also the drug ecstasy. I'm not referring to that. But the ecstasy, the jubilation, but in existentialism, the ecstasy, the ecstatic means standing out in existence. So Marinage, those sites don't need to be hidden. They need to stand out. We need to be fine not being at home in disorder and creating our own sites and institutions of well-being. They need to come into existence and stand out proudly. Or like Carnival, our time of radical acceptance needs to stand out for more than a season. Maybe it's again, these are projects that need to be taken with others. I can't decide this alone, but what if we extend it together? And so in the face of disorder, contingency, and non-belonging, for me, the ecstatic is a necessary state of well-being for Africana people. So it's not happiness that I'm trying to achieve and trying to advocate for the book, but I'm trying to advocate for the ecstatic. And these ecstatic communities will offer, again, freedom, that freedom of movement that's previously denied, the freedom to, again, create your own projects, or when Peony said the other 2 days ago, actually, the project of self-construction. It would have, again, a radical notion of hospitality in Morabaza, because again, Morabaza has the joy element in it. I use both within the text. Again, radical notions of hospitality. And then 3, because the instances of Chinda point to like queerness. Again, the everyday order of our world, if the social political orders we live under are actually disorder, that they allow for people to face horrible conditions of dehumanization on an everyday basis, or to use Frederick Engels, if social murder is the everyday progress of capitalism, if that's the norm within the society, people are left to slavery to make chocolate. If that's what's normal, maybe we need to radically upend that. And that is an inherently queer project of whatever's the norm, you go askance. So I want to upend the notions of happiness or everyday values, but I also want to keep queerness to also talk about sexual queerness. And that's where I'm always talking about belonging. So it's not just queer people that need belonging, but if Africana people aren't monolithic, they don't just show up one way, then our notions of belonging always have to expand. We have to be careful of not committing, I'd say, the crime of certain maroon communities where you're willing to protect your community for their well-being while sacrificing others. And as I told Jose earlier, the ecstatic community I'm trying to, again, build into a second fuller book project so I can dive more into, again, the Atlantic history, but also in Africa itself. But again, if we're going to talk about happiness, at least I hope I troubled the notion. We can disagree, but I hope I at least troubled why it isn't just an emotion. It's not something an affect. Affects are tied to society. And so with that said, I just want to leave you with a quotation I promised from W.E.B. Du Bois. So this is my favorite quotation in the world, probably, or top 2 at least. And so he writes, but with the death of your happiness may easily come increased happiness and satisfaction and fulfillment of other people, strangers, unborn babes, uncreated worlds. So by allowing the notion of colonial happiness to die, we actually might increase our chances of creating well-being in the world for strangers, unborn babes, and again, the uncreated ecstatic communities that are out there, waiting to be founded, waiting for us to join us. And again, I think there are numerous examples out there. So with that said, I'm very interested to hear any questions you all have. Thank you for your time and patience. Nothing in the chat so far. Oh, Jose, I know you have questions.
I know but when you're talking about the hospitality project, I mean, I see your project very much aligned with medical but we're trying to at least move towards something that is not decided by institutions that are aligned or by international organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And it'll help because there's a question in the chat next.
Well, yeah, it made me think about Jaime Brel. He's an Ecuadorian epidemiologist, and when he proposes decolonial public health or decolonial health, he talks about the values of solidarity and sustainability and also security. But I was mostly focusing on sovereignty. I was mostly thinking about solidarity when you mentioned radical hospitality. And I think something that happens when we try to move forward this decolonial project in Latin American social medicine is that there's also a limit to how much solidarity you can have or how much radical hospitality, because we have very much limited sovereignty. So I guess my question is, how do you see this project evolving? I mean, because there's a temporal, but there's also a spatial limit, right? Is this something that can be a national project, or is it limited to self-ascribed communities? I mean, how large or how small can we go with these ecstatic communities?
Yeah, so the third part of the book project was really interested in this question. If I'm disagreeing with notions of depression, in the second project, I'm disagreeing with our notions of happiness. And then the third part is like, I'm a very negative person. And so for me, that project was like, what type of positive project can we have out in the world, given that there are reasons why there are spatial and temporal limits to Carnival and Marriage? Some of it, especially with Marriage, is the sovereignty issue. And so for this book project, the way I conclude is talking about really how individuals and communities can start enacting things themselves. So what are we well enough to accomplish given the parameters of living in disordered world? Now, the reason why I said the ecstatic communities I want to build into a book project is because I want to expound upon, like, in a transnational and international sense of how much are we going to take Fanon at his word that in order for well-being to actually exist, it means upending the order of the world. So for me, the project is fully geared towards that. That you can only have a limited version of well-being, a limited notion of ecstatic communities in the world we currently live under. I think those are projects that we should volunteer to do, because I think the flip side of that is, again, the coloniality of happiness. So by gathering together, we can, again, have limited notions or limited senses of ecstatic communities. The issue with, again, that is that, again, it's limited. And so if we're going to push ourselves forward, then like Fanon, I think we need to know what are our limits. So if well-being can only be achieved by gaining sovereignty, and you can only gain sovereignty by upending, again, the international rule-based order, I think it requires, again, not only sense of being maladjusted, but in the other project I talked about to you in private, like, again, embracing our criminality. So there's a famous saying in the United States in the queer community, be gay, do crimes. Like, if we're if we're outlawed by the state, if we're already that fugitive population, if we're always on the sense of being captured again, there are ways in which our notions of well-being have to be tied to criminality, tied to, again, upending systems. Now, I can keep talking. So, because then it goes into notions of violence, what are our scopes of it. But like Fanon, I just say that the reason why I'm also shying away from happiness to the ecstasy into well-being is because Fanon pointed to the ways, and Cabral also did, that resistance, if it's part of our notions of well-being, have to let in some forms of violence. And that means violence against others, violence against systems. And I think often that gets away because we think of ourselves as like, oh, it's post-colonial, it's post-racial, when we're still in the thick of things.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for a wonderful conference. I really, really enjoyed it and learned a lot. I was wondering regarding that part on ecstatic communities,
Hmm.
I was wondering if you considered or are considering approaching the whole issue of religions based on African forms of religiosity. I'm thinking about candomblé in Brazil, but many other equivalent forms of religious practice, because they seem to fit very well into your model, so to speak. On the one hand, in candomblé, for instance, which I know a little bit more than others, uh, you have a healing process. I mean, there's a whole purpose of actually healing your psychological suffering. On the second point is that in many of the candomblé communities, you not only include queer people, but you actually do not have a structure of meaning and categorization that includes gender identity, and sexual orientation. And so you can move along these categories. And the third aspect, there will be many more, but the third aspect is that these communities have become political in the sense that they are resisting against evangelical and Christian repression. And so they're proposing a model which is very, very much connected to anti-racist politics and movements. And the whole thing, all of these three aspects, they are materialized in forms of festivity that are ecstatic themselves and that are incredibly joyful. So that's what I wanted to mention. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And I'm trying to look at you, but also, so I'm just gonna look at the camera,
Yeah, sure.
even though it feels a bit awkward. I'll look to the audience. It's less awkward that way. So one, yes, I fully agree that the second book project, just because with the dissertation, and this is just a revision and expansion on the dissertation, is limited in scope for purposes of like, again, getting your PhD and moving out. And I was like, I don't want to stay here forever. So one, the book project is trying to expand and look more at the history of Maroon communities, carnivals, and across Atlantic. So instead of just using piecemeal, but like actually doing a faithful study and pointing to the different parameters, but is also going to look at religion. So Candomblé, Santeria, different like cross-Atlantic mixtures. But in this book project, I do deal with Rastafarianism. So that's the most religion in this book project. I want to expand upon it, but the Rastafarianism comes with the notion of dread. So Neil Roberts has a wonderful quotation that when we think of dread and Rastafarianism, we can think of it almost in the biblical sense of awe. So it's a dreadful position. Awe is oftentimes translated as dread because you have an awful responsibility before God. Like you as a singular individual is before the God and you'll be judged. In Rastafarianism, particularly because it's social, what does it mean to take an awful responsibility for the conditions you live under? And so for me, the third section of my work says, well, what are we well enough to accomplish if we're not going for the coloniality of happiness? I said, as someone who faces depression, joy just doesn't do it for me. Every time I hear about, like, again, even in the United States, Black joy, like joy as resistance, I'm like, I am not joyful most of the time. Like, I'm depressed a lot. So if that's the case, if I'm not going to like be projects solely about joy, the Rastafarianism dread, that awful responsibility for the world and for creating new conditions, creating new spaces and sites and institutions, that for me was one way of connecting again, a Caribbean religion and their political projects. But again, it's always religious. I don't want to disentangle that. And saying, how can dread be a form of Africana existential resistance? So again, this is not to say I don't see Black Joy and Joy as Resistance Project as being meaningful, but as someone who has depression, again, I just always hear notions of smile, like to be joyful. I'm like, no, like even if we don't have joy under these conditions, you should still be responsible enough to change them. Maybe I don't have joy, but maybe my nephew, my niece, maybe my future children, maybe future generations will have that type of ecstasy. Even if I never taste it, maybe that's the type of dread I'm trying to institute. So I really love the question, and it's just giving me more motivation to really take on that second book project to dive into those religions. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let me check. Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat. Are there any other questions in the room? Yes. Probably. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this was really fascinating, and I found it really, really interesting. I don't really have it's not so much a question, it's a comment, because it's on the word ecstatic, which is so interesting, because I just went to a quick Google search as to the meaning of it, and it has the two meanings. So one is overwhelming happiness, but the other one, which I think is more what you're saying, is self-transcendence, in a sense, because your idea of this idea that that happiness is not something that should be seen as something individual, and the sharing of the happiness, the transcending of the self. So because ecstatic, at first when you said ecstatic communities, I was thinking, oh wow, what what do you mean by this? And this is presumably this is a concept that you've chosen, or does it come from the literature? Because I'm a bit ignorant.
So one, I think I'm expanding upon the literature, but I'm really drawing off of one. There's religious ecstasy. There's, again, a famous statue called the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. So there's been instances where I've been drawn to the term ecstasy, and there's a lot of religious connotations. But in terms of this project, the reason why I chose ecstatic is for two reasons. One, you already talked about, like the self-transcendence, like if well-being or affect, our moods, aren't simply individualistic, but they're social and they're tied to our environments. That means, what if I tied my well-being to your well-being? What if I tied Marabaza to, again, the joy and jubilation of including you, and now we have our co-project together? So in that sense of self-transcendence, like our moods are transcending ourselves constantly. How can we be aware of it? And how can we now have political projects that are geared towards, again, those notions of well-being that include as much as possible? But in terms of the literature, the second reason I use it is because in existentialism, in particular, you can do the Sartre, you can do Beauvoir, even in notions in Fanon. The ecstatic is separate. Ecstatic is to stand out. So existentially, moving about the world, it's about us standing out in the here and there. And for me, the reason why I particularly like this notion of standing out, because in political phenomenology, particularly the work of Hannah Arendt, she talks about being political is about engaging through speech and action with others, a plurality of others. But she says all this is done as a process of self-disclosure. I'm standing out. Like that's what it means to engage politically. You stand out on your principles. You stand out among equals. And so for me, I was like, okay, I want my notion of well-being to be spatial and temporal. And therefore, it also must be able to stand out. And this is in a sense to, again, combat some of the issues with invisibility, combat some of the issues of like those maroon communities. It's very hard to get to. It's very hard to see. Well-being exists. You got to get there, but it's constantly under threat. And so what happens if we join together in that project? And for me, that's a decolonial project, it's a revolutionary project, but it's something that actually has to stand out in the world, and because it's a project of ours. Thank you. Just making sure the chat. So I just know it's 7:28. So Jose, how do you want to do things?
Well, well, I was just, you ended I thought at least you ended the talk talking about futurity, right?
Mhm.
And then you mentioned your nephews and future children. And it made me wonder, as a political project, it's not a project that you envision for yourself, but it's something that's going to happen possibly for future generations, hopefully? Or is it something that's always needs to keep kind of unfolding, never ending?
So the third section of the book talks about what future projects, so what current project I can take on myself. And so the notion of being well enough to act and like take that dreadful responsibility for the world means engaging not only with others. So like, it's not simply my teaching. It's not simply like, again, I'm not a scholar activist, but it's not simply like the activism I do in the world to create these possibilities. For me, if we know that these spaces are going to be limited because the disorder still exists, the futurity is about saying that I have to be committed to this present project, even if I don't get any of the benefits. That's really where the future, like, again, you're working to create things a reality. Like, that's what happiness is. Like, the possibility is becoming a reality. That's where my joy is coming from. Like, I've attained it. Like, I don't ever want to let go. It's not a utopian project. Like, it'll exist in no place or someplace really far down the line, those ecstatic communities. No, I think we can create little mini versions of ecstatic communities wherever we go, but we always have to be responsible to take on that project, knowing that the conditions we face are repressive, that they are going to criminalize us, that the type of well-being we want in this world is contra to the actual parameters of how the world is set up. And so for me, no, this is always a present ongoing project. Like, if you're committed to ecstatic communities, if you're committed to combating the coloniality of happiness, it's something you do today. But also knowing, like, if we'll just say the transatlantic form of slavery, colonization, the colonial modern world, if you're using like Mignolo, Dussel, if that's a 500-year long project, it might take 500 years of fighting to upend. And I might not live to again, if I had children, grandkids, but what does it mean to teach them drugs? Like, hey, we're struggling today. We've had some successes, we had some losses, but as Frederick Douglass said, the struggle continues. So for me, like, I hope I clarified.
No, I do have one more question. Since we are,
You're the moderator, so
well, since we invited you from Anthropological Institute, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask something directly related to anthropology. And even though you didn't talk about it today, I know your book project, you have described it as an autoethnography before, and it's part of your methodological approach. Which reminds me of a very recent conversation that's Juno Salazar-Pareñas just started, where she's reconsidering the place of ethnography within anthropology, and whether we should really continue to think of ethnography as something that's owned by anthropology. For example, but Salazar-Pareñas refers to themselves as an anthropologically informed ethnography. So I just wanted to know why you use autoethnography in other parts of your book as an approach, and why autoethnography? Why not just call it ethnography? And also, I wanted to know if anthropologists have commented on this, and what philosophers have also said about the use of ethnography.
So most of the audience I get are mixed. So it's mostly a mix of like philosophers and political scientists or political theorists, if I'm being honest. I'd say I'd need to gauge more with anthropologists to gauge their reactions. I just, like, me talking to you would give me the most evidence that I have, if I'm being thoroughly honest. That said, the project mostly uses phenomenology and autoethnography together in the second section because I wanted to take a Fanonian project seriously. That if I'm looking at how values, actions, institutes are tied to social environments, then if I'm looking at depression, I have to take social conditions in mind. And so the first section dealt with, well, what is the Black experience in the United States? How does it show us that our notions of depression are wrong in certain ways? So biomedical models, the DSM, for instance, what do they get wrong? It's because they discount the social. They can talk about social stressors, like losing your job is a stressor and it can, again, mess with your mental health. But as soon as you talk about, well, what about racism? What about capitalism? Those are just our normal background conditions. And if you live in a racist society, well, wouldn't it be normal to then be racist? So for me, that first part of the project was saying, what is the Black experience? Show us the ways in which depression can go wrong. But I'm like, if I'm doing a project, a sociodiagnostic project, I have to realize that I'm not just a Black, that how does depression function given my unique Cape Verdean experience? And so for me, I'm like, what is that colonial history? What is that, again, racialized history? What is that diasporic history? Because again, being a Cape Verdean part of the American diaspora is very different if you grew up in Portugal, if you grew up in Scandinavia. And so the phenomenology was about my lived experience. Like, how do I uniquely encounter depression going on in the world? And so the book has examples of that. Ever since I was 16, that first instance where I had depression for 2 years. Again, those were mild forms of depression, but when I went to college, I had an intense form of depression where I left school, and for 2 years, I didn't do anything. I went to the library, read books, but my family kept me going. They supported me. I didn't have a job, and I was able to eventually get back to school and become a professor. But I'm like, their unique understanding of depression, along with, again, psychological understanding of depression in the United States. And again, what does it mean to be someone from Fogu, where Doru di Fogu, because people would rather hurt themselves than others? Like, how does that play into my understanding of depression? And so the autoethnography was really coming into play because how do I look at myself, my family's history, but also being in one of the largest Cape Verdean diasporas? How do these notions of depression get entwined in my own understanding? And therefore, what do they say, and going back to the ethnography part, what do they say about depression in all these Cape Verdean locations? And so for me, I'm like, that's what sociodiagnostics is actually about. You always tie in the social, and it's not just about being an African diasporic subject. It's not simply being Black, it's Cape Verdean. And those histories need to come out. And so this is why I say the book project is very limited, because I think if you're still only sticking to Black people, well, how do Dominican, like how do Haitians, how do Angolans? They're gonna have unique, again, autoethnography, but again, social conditions that are gonna frame how they think of depression, how they think of well-being. And so I think this is why I really think the project can keep on expanding. People can take this up. It's not just about my project alone. It's about saying, if you can see the value of sociodiagnostics in this project, how can we transform our notions of well-being for everybody? So the community you're a part of. So if you're Maori, you have unique social conditions. How's your notion of depression, sadness, happiness, and well-being? What do you uniquely need in order to institute that in the world? So that's really where phenomenology and autoethnography came into play. And when I was doing the project and I stumbled upon autoethnography about how an individual observer who doesn't have to be objective because they're in it, how can that individual show what their society thinks about depression really came about? And again, from philosophers and political theorists, they like the inclusion of the personal, but like an anthropologist, maybe I get more critiques and maybe have to tailor things.
I think it's perfect. I would just thought it, but I understand why.
Yeah, it's just, again, the literature at the time that I was diving into was really about how like because again, ethnography, someone not connected with the land at all is going in and giving us like a study, whereas autoethnography was about people diving into their own communities.
Self-reflexive aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
No, no.
And thank you, everyone.